What happens when a racist police officer crosses paths with a black veteran who's had enough? In this powerful and intense story, we see an unforgettable encounter between two men from very different worlds. One is a young officer who lets his prejudice get the best of him, and the other, a seasoned military veteran with years of life experience and wisdom. What begins as a routine stop quickly escalates into something that neither man expected. The officer's arrogance leads him down a dangerous path, but the veteran is ready to teach him a lesson he will never forget. This is more than just a confrontation, it's a moment of reckoning. As tensions rise, the officer starts to realize that the cost of his actions might be more than he can bear. But will it be too late for him to change his ways? Find out in the next part. It started as a routine flight for everyone on board, until one shocking moment turned the entire day upside down. A confident and successful black woman walked onto the plane, excited for her journey. But little did she know, her presence would ignite an unbelievable series of events. The pilot, a man trusted with lives and responsibilities, shockingly refused to fly her. His actions, laced with prejudice, left the passengers stunned and her in disbelief. As whispers spread through the cabin, tension rose and emotions ran high. But just when it seemed like injustice would prevail, her husband stepped in. Calm, determined, and armed with more than just words, he made sure this pilot faced the consequences of his actions. What happened next left everyone speechless and changed the pilot's life forever. Stay tuned to see how this extraordinary moment unfolded and why he instantly regretted his decision. The tension in the cabin was palpable as the passengers exchanged uneasy glances. No one knew exactly what was going on, but the air was thick with uncertainty. The woman, still standing in the aisle, tried to process what had just happened. The pilot's refusal to fly her wasn't just confusing, it was personal. She had traveled all over the world, never once facing such blatant discrimination. Her mind raced, but she refused to show any weakness. She was strong, confident, and proud. But this was different. She could feel the eyes of every person in the cabin on her, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable. As the whispers grew louder, the woman's husband, sitting just a few rows behind, stood up. He had been quietly observing the situation, but now he knew it was time to act. Calmly, he approached the flight attendant, asking what was going on. The attendant, visibly stressed, hesitated before explaining the situation. "He won't fly her," the attendant whispered. "The pilot, he's refusing her because of something personal. He doesn't think she belongs on this flight." Her husband's face darkened. He had seen his wife face discrimination before, but this was different. It was open, deliberate. As a man who had fought for justice in countless ways, he wasn't about to let this slide. He was more than just her partner. He was someone who had learned to stand up, even when it seemed impossible. And today, he was ready to do whatever it took. He walked up to the cockpit, his stride purposeful, but not hurried. The tension followed him as he passed by rows of passengers who watched in silence. He knocked once on the door. When the pilot opened it, his expression was cold and unreadable. "I don't know what's going on here," her husband began, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. "But I'm not going to let you turn this into something that doesn't belong in the air. You're here to do your job, not to make decisions based on your prejudice." The pilot's face shifted, but only for a second. He wasn't ready to back down. He was a man in power, and power was something he was used to wielding. "I don't have to explain myself," the pilot muttered. "I'm in charge here." "Not anymore," her husband shot back. "You may be the one flying the plane, but you're not the one deciding who belongs here. I'm going to make sure this gets reported, and you'll answer for this behavior." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a promise that the pilot couldn't easily shake off. He knew this wasn't just about a passenger or a flight. It was about his actions, his choices, and the power he had abused. As the confrontation unfolded, the passengers could feel the tension in the cabin mounting. Some were already pulling out their phones, silently recording the altercation. Others were silently hoping for it to end quickly. But no one could deny the discomfort of watching this injustice unfold. The flight attendants, unsure of what to do, exchanged nervous looks. They had seen difficult situations before, but this was different. They had to tread carefully, but they also knew that the truth couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, the woman stood where she was, not backing down. She had spent her whole life learning how to stand tall in the face of adversity. And now this moment would test everything she believed in. She was determined to stay calm, but her heart was pounding. "Let's not forget why we're all here," she said to the passengers, her voice carrying through the cabin. "We're all just trying to get where we need to go. I'm no different from anyone else on this plane." Her words hung in the air, but the pilot's gaze never wavered. The situation had escalated quickly, and now there was no turning back. What was supposed to be a routine flight had become a battleground for something much bigger. Her husband's voice broke through the tension again. "You'll regret this," he said, not just to the pilot, but to everyone who had turned a blind eye. "We all will if we don't do something about it." The words echoed in the silence, leaving everyone to wonder what would come next. Would the pilot back down, or would he dig his heels in, ready to fight for his pride? The passengers, once passive observers, were now caught in the middle of a conflict that was much larger than a simple flight delay. And as the minutes stretched on, the story of this moment began to grow, one that no one on board would ever forget. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath, every second stretching out longer than the last. The pilot stood in the cockpit doorway, his jaw clenched, his hands resting on the frame as if to brace himself against the words he knew were coming. Her husband's voice had been calm, but there was an unmistakable fire behind his eyes. The tension was palpable, building like a storm ready to burst. The passengers, once silently observing, were now leaning forward in their seats, some whispering, others just frozen in place. No one dared move as the air in the cabin seemed to grow thicker. A low murmur started to ripple through the rows of seats, people exchanging uneasy glances as the situation seemed to escalate with no end in sight. Her husband didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on the pilot, unwavering, as if daring him to make the next move. The woman stood just behind him, her heart racing, but her face a mask of calm determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced by prejudice, for every injustice that had been allowed to slide by unnoticed. The flight attendants were now gathered in the back, speaking quietly, exchanging nervous glances. They had no power in this situation, but they couldn't help but feel the weight of it. They could see it, too, the wrongness of what was happening. And they knew, deep down, that something had to give. But what? The pilot remained silent for what felt like an eternity, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowing. It was clear he wasn't ready to admit he had overstepped, wasn't ready to back down. But the longer he stood there, the more the air seemed to close in around him. The pressure was mounting, and he could feel the eyes of the passengers, eyes full of disbelief, anger, and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Judgment. Then the woman's voice broke the silence, soft but powerful. "You don't get to decide who belongs on this flight. You don't get to decide who deserves to be treated with respect. You think your power can keep me off this plane, but it doesn't work that way." She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. The passengers held their breath. There was something about the way she spoke, something undeniable, like the truth itself was pressing through the tension in the air. The pilot's face darkened, and for a moment, it looked like he might snap, his fists clenched at his sides. He took a step back, his hand resting on the doorframe of the cockpit, and for the briefest moment, it seemed like he might shut the door and end the confrontation right there. But before he could act, her husband moved again, stepping forward with quiet but deliberate resolve. "You'll have to answer for this," he said, his voice firm. "And not just to her. You'll answer to everyone on this plane, and to anyone who hears about this." The tension in the cabin spiked, and the murmurs grew louder. The flight attendants were now openly watching, unsure of what was going to happen next. Some of the passengers had already started recording, their phones raised, capturing the moment when the balance of power shifted. Everyone was waiting for something, anything, to break the stalemate. The pilot's eyes darted toward the flight attendants, then to the passengers. He could feel the eyes on him, and for the first time, he seemed unsure, like his confidence was faltering. The whispers were no longer quiet. They were growing, spreading like wildfire. The weight of the situation was sinking in, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. But before he could speak, the woman took another step forward, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about a flight. It's about what kind of world we live in, and whether or not we're willing to accept this kind of treatment anymore. You don't get to decide who belongs, and you don't get to decide who gets to fly." Her words hit like a punch. The cabin seemed to fall even quieter, the tension almost unbearable. The air was thick with anticipation. Every person on that plane now waiting for the pilot's response, the moment when this would either be resolved or spiral into something worse. The pilot finally stepped back, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, but the look on his face told everyone what he was thinking. He didn't want to be the one who'd caused a scene, but he also didn't want to lose control. The room seemed frozen, everyone on edge, waiting for that one moment when everything would change. The woman's husband stood by her side, silent but resolute. The air in the cabin was taut, like a wire stretched too thin. Something had to snap. And just as it seemed like the moment of reckoning had arrived, the pilot turned his back, leaving the door to the cockpit wide open. The tension in the cabin broke with a collective gasp, and in that instant, everyone realized something was about to happen, something that would change everything. But what? No one knew, and that was the most terrifying part. The pilot's sudden retreat into the cockpit left everyone breathless, as if the tension in the air had been coiled too tightly, waiting for that moment to snap. But just as the door clicked shut behind him, something else shifted, a sound distant but growing louder. The unmistakable hum of the plane's engine sputtered, then faltered. The cabin stilled, and a deep unease spread like wildfire. Passengers looked at each other, their eyes wide with confusion. The air, once thick with tension, now seemed to vibrate with the hum of uncertainty. The pilot had not just stepped away. Something was wrong. Something bigger than anyone had anticipated. Her husband turned, his brow furrowed. "What the hell is going on now?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But before anyone could respond, the intercom crackled to life, breaking the fragile silence. A shaky voice echoed from the front of the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight attendant speaking. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We will provide further updates shortly." The words, meant to reassure, did anything but. The murmurs of the passengers began to swell into hushed panic, and a cold wave of fear swept through the cabin. Her heart raced. Was this an accident? Was something truly wrong with the plane? Or was it something more? The woman's mind raced, her stomach twisting into knots. The pilot had walked away, leaving the plane in the hands of a crew who had no control over the situation. Was this deliberate? Had he sabotaged the flight in some way, taking his anger out on the passengers? Was this his way of trying to regain control after everything that had happened? And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the plane jolted suddenly, throwing everyone forward in their seats. A collective gasp rose up from the passengers, some of them clutching the armrests, others muttering prayers under their breath. The plane seemed to shake with a violent force, the roar of the engines almost drowned out by the growing panic in the cabin. "Stay calm, everyone," the flight attendant's voice came through the intercom again, but her tone was shaky. "We are experiencing some turbulence. Please stay in your seats. We'll have more information soon." But it wasn't turbulence. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the kind of bump you'd expect from a storm or high winds. The unease in the air was undeniable. The woman's grip on the armrest tightened. She could feel her breath quicken, her mind whirling. What was really happening? The seconds felt like hours. And then through the murmur of voices, a scream rang out from the back of the plane. A woman stood up, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. "The pilot's gone. He's not in the cockpit. Someone's trying to hijack the plane." Panic erupted in an instant. The woman's heart skipped a beat as the chaos spread through the cabin like wildfire. People jumped to their feet, shouting, some trying to push their way toward the exits, others clutching their loved ones in fear. Her husband grabbed her arm, pulling her closer. "We need to stay calm," he said, his voice tight but controlled. "We don't know what's happening yet. Don't let them turn this into a panic." But it was already happening. People were scrambling for anything to hold on to, some desperately pressing the flight attendant for answers. The once orderly plane had descended into chaos, the flickering overhead lights only adding to the sense of impending doom. The woman, her chest tightening, tried to steady herself. She could hear the whispers growing louder, each passenger coming to their own conclusion, their fears spilling over. Was this some kind of revenge? Had the pilot planned this all along? Or was this a random, horrific twist of fate? And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the plane lurched again, this time harder, throwing people to the floor, the sharp cry of a man's voice cutting through the panic. A sense of impending doom swept through the cabin. The last thing the passengers needed was to be caught in the chaos of a malfunctioning plane, and yet the possibility seemed more real with every passing second. The flight attendants, overwhelmed and now visibly scared, were rushing up and down the aisles, trying to calm passengers, offering little more than vague reassurances. But no one could ignore the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And with the pilot nowhere to be found, and the plane swerving dangerously, there was no telling what would happen next. For the woman, this was no longer about a man who had refused to fly her. It was about survival. The stakes had risen to an unimaginable level, and now the very survival of everyone on board hung in the balance. The plane shook again, more violently this time, and the screams of terrified passengers filled the cabin. Her heart pounded in her chest as the fear spread like wildfire. The chaos was uncontrollable, people shouting at the flight attendants, demanding answers, clutching their seatbelts in desperation. The flight attendants, now visibly panicked themselves, could only offer weak reassurances. The woman's husband was calm, though. He grabbed her hand tightly. "We need to stay together. We'll make it through this." She nodded, but the fear in her chest was growing, a knot tightening with each passing second. There was no more rational thinking now, no more hope of a quick resolution. The situation had spiraled into something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Then, just as it seemed the plane was heading straight for disaster, there was a sudden loud bang from the cockpit, followed by a moment of complete silence. Her husband tensed, his eyes narrowing. "That's it," he muttered. "We're running out of time." With no more hesitation, he stood and rushed to the cockpit, pushing past the frantic passengers, a man on a mission. The woman followed him, her breath shallow, praying that whatever was happening, it wasn't too late. As they reached the cockpit door, the flight attendants, now desperate, stepped aside. The door was cracked open, the interior dim and foreboding. Her husband pushed it wide, revealing the unimaginable. The pilot, standing frozen, his hands trembling as he clutched the controls, his face pale. But it wasn't sabotage, not in the way they had feared. The plane was shaking because of something far worse. He had lost control. He had no idea how to regain it. "Get in here," her husband barked at the pilot. "Let me handle this." The pilot seemed paralyzed with fear, his eyes wide, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I can't control it." I tried, but his voice trailed off as the plane lurched again, this time throwing everyone inside the cockpit. Without thinking, the woman's husband moved to the controls. "Sit down." "We'll figure this out," he said, voice steady as he took over. The urgency was clear in his eyes. He had experience, maybe not as a pilot, but as a man who had faced far more dangerous situations in his life. And now his calmness was the only thing that could save them. But just as they seemed to be regaining control, the cockpit door slammed shut behind them with a deafening force, trapping them inside. The woman spun around, heart racing, as she realized that someone else had just locked them in. A voice echoed from the back of the plane, cold and unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come in here." The pilot's voice had changed, now laced with venom, and it didn't belong to the man she had seen moments ago. It wasn't the same voice. Her husband's head snapped toward the door, eyes widening with realization. This was the final twist, the moment when everything they thought they knew shattered. The pilot they had trusted had been hiding something far more sinister. He hadn't lost control of the plane. He had deliberately set it up to fail, creating the illusion of malfunction. And as if to confirm their worst fears, the cockpit lights flickered, and the plane jolted again, this time violently. Someone was sabotaging it from inside. The woman's heart stopped. This was no longer just about prejudice. This was about a man playing God with lives, and now they were trapped in a plane barreling toward an uncertain fate. Her husband's eyes met hers, a silent understanding between them. There was no more time for hesitation. They had to act fast. The woman grabbed a fire extinguisher from the side, her hands shaking as she swung it toward the cockpit door. Her husband was already pulling at the controls, trying to regain control of the plane. The cockpit door rattled under the pressure, but it wouldn't give. She swung again, harder this time, and with a sickening crack, the door burst open, revealing a second figure, hidden in the shadows, stepped forward, a gun in hand. The woman froze. A voice inside her screamed, but she didn't move. And then, as if the universe had decided this was the moment to throw them a lifeline, the gunshot rang out. But it wasn't aimed at them. The second figure, the one standing behind the pilot, collapsed to the floor, a bullet lodged in his chest. The woman's eyes darted toward her husband, whose hand had just dropped from the firearm he had pulled from his belt. He had saved them. The pilot, wide-eyed and breathing heavily, seemed to snap out of his stupor. He scrambled to pull the plane back on course as the woman's husband turned toward her with a grim look in his eyes. "We're not done yet. Stay close." As the chaos in the cockpit settled, the woman's mind raced. The pilot wasn't the only danger on this flight. The entire crew had been compromised. And though they had averted disaster, the real danger was far from over. The question now was, who else was in on this? And how far did the conspiracy go? But that was a problem for later. For now, the immediate threat was averted. The plane was under control, and the passengers, now realizing what had truly happened, slowly began to breathe again. The woman took her husband's hand. The nightmare wasn't over. But in that moment, they had won. For now. Inside the coffee shop, the atmosphere quickly returned to normal. The hum of the espresso machine, the clink of cups, and the murmur of quiet conversations filled the air once more. But the barista couldn't help but smile as the group of regulars approached with a tip jar. One of them, a woman with a mischievous grin, winked and handed it over, saying, "For handling that Karen like a pro." The barista blinked in surprise, then laughed as they all started clapping, adding their contributions to the jar. "You guys are the best," the barista said, their face lighting up with genuine appreciation. The crowd around the counter cheered, and for a brief moment, it felt like they had all united against a common enemy, turning a chaotic morning into a shared victory. The tip jar was overflowing, a small but meaningful reward for the barista's patience. Outside, Karen continued her rant, still on the phone, unaware of the small rebellion that had taken place inside the coffee shop. Her frustration was palpable as she paced back and forth, each step more furious than the last. But the worst was yet to come. In the parking lot, Karen's day was about to hit its peak of absurdity. She was already angry about the coffee shop incident, but when she noticed the note on her windshield, her blood pressure skyrocketed. She ripped it off with a snarl and read it aloud, her voice growing louder with disbelief. "Thanks for parking like you own the place. Your Tao is on the house." The words seemed to mock her, and the irony was almost too much to bear. The crowd gathered nearby couldn't help but laugh as the tow truck began its work. Some people waved, others pulled out their phones, ready to record the spectacle. Karen was beside herself now, shouting at the tow truck driver, pleading with him to let her go. But there was no negotiating. The truck's winch whined as it lifted her car off the ground, and her protest turned to furious cries of injustice. But the universe wasn't done with her yet. Just as Karen attempted to argue with the security guard about her supposed rights, a police officer appeared, responding to complaints about her obstructing the lot. The officer approached with a calm, professional demeanor, assessing the situation with practiced ease. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to issue a citation for obstructing traffic," the officer said, his voice polite but firm. Karen's face twisted in disbelief as she tried to explain herself, but her words fell flat. The officer handed her the citation without hesitation, and for the first time that day, her once confident attitude crumbled. She stood there in stunned silence, watching as her car was slowly driven away, her day unraveling in front of her. For everyone else, it was a moment of pure karmic justice, a fitting conclusion to Karen's entitled behavior. The crowd cheered, some recording, some laughing, all of them reveling in the spectacle of her downfall. It wasn't just about the car being towed or the ticket. It was the collective reminder that no one, no matter how loud or demanding, was above the rules. As Karen stormed off, her protests growing fainter, the crowd dispersed, phones full of videos that would no doubt spread like wildfire on social media. It wasn't just a victory for the barista or the customers. It was a reminder that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing things out. And as for Karen, her day had just gone from bad to worse, and it seemed that no amount of yelling would change that.